What happens when you judge someone based on appearance, only to realize you've just insulted one of the most powerful people in the room. Ethan Miller, a confident but arrogant waiter, made a joke at a guest's expense, thinking it was harmless. But when the restaurant manager greeted the man with absolute respect, Ethan's world came crashing down. Who was this mysterious guest? And how would Ethan face the consequences of his mistake? Stay tuned. Like and subscribe for more. Los Angeles, California. A city where wealth and power were on full display, especially on a Saturday night like this. The streets outside were lined with sleek black cars, their tinted windows hiding celebrities, CEOs, and socialites who had come to indulge in the best the city had to offer. Inside La Maison, one of LA's most prestigious fine dining restaurants, the air buzzed with quiet sophistication. Soft candlelight flickered on the white linen tablecloths, reflecting off delicate crystal glasses and polished silverware. Conversations floated through the air, low, measured, elegant. The type of talk that only came from people who were used to wealth, power, and privilege. At a prime corner table, a man sat with quiet confidence. James Carter, a name that carried weight in the world of technology, innovation, and business. Yet looking at him, one wouldn't immediately know. He wasn't dressed like most of the men in the room who made sure their wealth was obvious. Their tailored Tom Ford suits, Rolex watches, and Italian leather shoes all screaming for attention. James, on the other hand, didn't need any of that. His presence alone was enough. A simple white dress shirt, crisp and perfectly fitted, lay beneath a black blazer that hugged his broad shoulders effortlessly. No flashy designer labels, no expensive accessories. Just quiet, undeniable authority. Seated around him were his colleagues, 3 men and 2 women, all equally composed, all dressed with similar understated elegance. They laughed occasionally, engaged in easy conversation, their postures relaxed yet refined. James leaned back slightly, a half-smile on his face, the kind that hinted at a man who had seen it all and still held control over the room. Across the restaurant, standing near the bar, Ethan Miller, a young waiter in his mid-20s, observed the scene with a sharp, practiced gaze. He had been working here for 2 years now, long enough to recognize wealth at first glance. Ethan prided himself on his ability to spot money. He had developed a system. He could tell who was worth millions and who was just pretending. It was all in the details, the shoes, the watches, the handbags, the way a person ordered their wine. It wasn't just about wealth, though. To Ethan, it was about power, who deserved respect and who didn't. And James, to Ethan, he was a nobody. At least, that was what Ethan thought. James didn't fit the mold of the typical high-profile guest. He wasn't adorned with symbols of excess, wasn't loudly demanding attention. He didn't exude the arrogance Ethan had come to associate with CEOs and high rollers. No, James looked too normal. As Ethan continued to scan the room, his eyes flickered between the other tables. Senator Holt, an older man with silver hair, sat at table 12, enjoying an aged steak while laughing with 2 high-profile investors. Over at table 7, a young tech billionaire, barely in his 30s, showed off his latest Patek Philippe watch, a piece worth more than most people made in a year. These were the types of people Ethan expected to serve tonight. But James, no Rolex, no Gucci loafers, no flash, just a calm, composed presence. And in Ethan's mind, that made James insignificant. Ethan checked his notepad, mentally running through his assigned tables for the evening. Table 3, James Carter and his group. He scoffed slightly under his breath, barely paying them a second thought. His real focus was on the guests who he believed mattered. As he made his way toward James' table, he smoothed out his crisp white apron, straightening his posture. He had perfected his restaurant persona, polite, professional, but with a slight edge of arrogance that only a seasoned waiter in a high-end establishment could carry. He had learned that in a place like La Maison, knowing how to carry yourself was just as important as the food you served. Reaching the table, he quickly analyzed the group once more. The men were dressed well, but not in a way that screamed money. The women carried elegant purses, but they weren't the latest designer bags making waves on social media. Middle management, maybe, he thought to himself. "Good evening," Ethan greeted smoothly, placing the water glasses on the table. His voice was warm, but there was an undertone, a barely noticeable dismissiveness. "Welcome to La Maison. I hope you're all having a wonderful evening." James looked up, his dark brown eyes meeting Ethan's with a calm intensity. "We are," he replied simply, his voice deep and steady. Ethan nodded, barely registering the response before launching into his well-rehearsed introduction of the menu. "Tonight, we have an exquisite dry-aged Wagyu steak, one of the finest cuts in the city. It pairs beautifully with our selection of red wines. I'd highly recommend it." He let his gaze flicker toward James, then smirked slightly. And then he made the mistake. "But you look more like a salad guy." For a moment's silence. It was only a second, maybe two, but in that brief moment something shifted. James didn't react, not immediately. His expression remained neutral, unreadable. His posture, still relaxed, didn't change. But there was a shift, a subtle one, something that only the most observant people in the room might have noticed. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a brief pause before he blinked. The others at the table exchanged quick glances, some raising their eyebrows, some suppressing a smirk. But no one laughed. Ethan, however, didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. To him, this was just another night, another guest, another moment of subtle superiority that made his job slightly more entertaining. He turned back to the rest of the group, expecting to move past it. But what Ethan didn't realize, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that he had just made a very, very big mistake. James Carter wasn't just another guest. He was the most powerful person in the room, and Ethan had just insulted him. Ethan, still oblivious, jotted down the rest of the orders as he made his way through the table. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the next table, the next opportunity to impress the guests who actually mattered. But James was watching, not in anger, not in frustration, but with quiet observation, because James had seen this exact scenario play out before. He knew exactly what was happening. And soon, so would Ethan. Because before the night was over, Ethan Miller was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. And it had already begun. Ethan Miller strode toward table 3 with the confidence of someone who believed they had the world figured out. After 2 years working in one of the most prestigious fine dining establishments in Los Angeles, he had developed an instinct. He could tell who was worth his time and who wasn't. He had served actors, real estate moguls, tech billionaires. He knew how to play the game, when to lay on the charm, when to subtly assert dominance. To him, this was an art form, a performance where he dictated who deserved special attention and who was just another face in the crowd. And James Carter, he was just another face. Ethan had already decided that before he even reached the table. The man's suit was too simple, his presence too understated. No signs of extravagant wealth, no power moves, no signals that he was one of the important ones. So when Ethan finally arrived at the table, his mind was already made up. Ethan set the water glasses down, his motion smooth, calculated. He greeted the group with his signature polished tone, scanning their faces briefly before launching into the night's menu. "Tonight, we have an exquisite dry-aged Wagyu steak," he began, slipping into his well-rehearsed speech. It's one of the finest cuts you'll find in the city. Pairs beautifully with a deep red wine, a perfect choice for someone looking for a true indulgence. Then his gaze flicked over to James and the smirk appeared. But, he added, pausing just long enough to make it feel intentional, you look more like a salad guy. It was subtle, but the implication was clear. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an innocent suggestion. It was a jab, a small, carefully placed insult disguised as humor. The kind of comment that could be brushed off as just a joke if questioned. Ethan had used this technique before, the little power play of making assumptions about people, putting them in boxes before they even had a chance to prove themselves. But this time, he had chosen the wrong person. For the first time that night, the table fell completely silent, the kind of silence that wasn't natural, the kind of silence that felt heavy. James Carter didn't move. He didn't react, didn't laugh, didn't even shift in his seat. He simply watched. His dark eyes, calm but sharp, studied Ethan with an intensity that most people would have noticed immediately. But Ethan was too full of himself to notice. The other guests exchanged glances, a few subtly raising their eyebrows. One of the women sitting next to James shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the position of her wine glass. It was a small movement, but it spoke volumes. She had heard the insult. So had the man sitting across from James, whose fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. The only person completely unfazed was James himself. He sat still, expression unreadable, as if giving Ethan a chance to correct himself. But Ethan, oblivious, didn't take it. Instead, he turned his attention to the rest of the group, convinced his joke had passed unnoticed. Ethan continued speaking, rattling off the other menu specials, jotting down orders with his usual air of superiority. In his mind, this was just another moment in another shift. The guests were just customers. The meals were just plates of food. The conversations were just background noise. And James Carter, just another forgettable man in a forgettable suit. As Ethan turned to leave, a small grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had won. To him, it was a tiny victory, a harmless bit of fun at someone else's expense. Nothing personal, just a joke. But the thing about assumptions, they can be deadly, and Ethan had just made the biggest assumption of his life. James Carter slowly leaned back in his chair, finally moving for the first time since the comment had been made. Still, he didn't speak. He didn't need to, because James had seen this exact situation play out before. He had seen men like Ethan his entire life, the ones who thought they could judge a person's worth in seconds. The ones who equated wealth with arrogance, power with appearance, respect with designer brands. James had seen those men fail. And tonight, James knew exactly what was coming next. Ethan moved on to his other tables, blissfully unaware of what had just happened. He checked in with Table 12, where Senator Holt and his group were discussing the stock market. He took drink orders at Table 7, where a venture capitalist was loudly talking about his latest real estate investment. But no matter where he went, something felt off. A shift had occurred. He couldn't quite place it, but it was there, subtle but unmistakable. It was in the way people looked at him. The way the whispers seemed slightly more pronounced. The way the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly in a different direction. But Ethan, too wrapped up in his own self-importance, brushed it off. He had no idea that his night had already changed, that he had already set things in motion, that the biggest lesson of his life was about to unfold, and that soon, very soon, his arrogance would cost him everything. The night had carried on like any other. Tables were filled with laughter, quiet conversations, and the clinking of fine crystal against porcelain. The restaurant pulsed with the kind of controlled elegance that only the wealthiest of guests could maintain. Ethan Miller, lost in his usual rhythm of service, paid no real attention to Table 3 after he had taken their orders. To him, James Carter and his colleagues were forgettable. He had already labeled them as mid-level professionals, people who had money but not the kind of wealth that commanded true respect in a place like this. As the evening went on, Ethan effortlessly slipped into his role. He poured $300 bottles of wine for a famous actor at Table 5. He catered to the over-the-top demands of a real estate tycoon at Table 14. He even took a moment to joke with the maitre d' about how some guests just didn't belong in a restaurant of this caliber. And all the while, he had no idea that he had made the biggest mistake of his career. No idea that his night was about to take a turn he would never forget. It wasn't until the end of the meal that everything began to shift. Ethan was busy clearing plates when he noticed James standing up. He barely paid attention at first. He was more focused on scanning the room, keeping an eye on the VIP tables. His mind was already elsewhere, thinking about tips about which guests were worth impressing, about how soon he could finish his shift. But then, something happened. James made his way to the front counter, and the entire energy of the restaurant changed. Ethan heard it before he saw it. A voice, one filled with urgency and unmistakable respect. "Mr. Carter, it's an absolute honor to have you here." Ethan's hands froze mid-motion. His head snapped toward the front, his stomach twisting with sudden unease. That voice, that was Richard Collins, the general manager of La Maison. A man who rarely, if ever, showed genuine excitement over a guest. Ethan slowly turned and saw Richard himself standing at the counter, his posture suddenly straighter, his hands adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, his usual stoic expression replaced with something that looked almost humble. "Had I known, I would have arranged our VIP section for you." The words landed like a grenade. The name, Mr. Carter, the tone, absolute respect, the body language, deferential. Ethan's blood ran cold. A strange, suffocating wave of realization crashed over him. No, it couldn't be. He had served James Carter tonight, but not just any James Carter. The James Carter, the same name he had seen splashed across Forbes magazine covers. The same man whose company had been at the forefront of Silicon Valley's biggest tech breakthroughs. The same billionaire who was known not just in the industry, but across the world. And Ethan had insulted him. Ethan felt his entire body lock up as he watched James calmly reach into his pocket and pull out his credit card. Not just any credit card, a sleek, matte black card. Ethan knew exactly what that card was. A Centurion card. An Amex black card, the kind of card that most people would never even qualify to apply for. The kind that only belonged to multi-millionaires and billionaires who spent more money in a week than Ethan would make in a lifetime. It was a card that didn't have a limit, didn't require approval, didn't need validation. It was a statement, a reminder of power. And Ethan felt like throwing up. His mind was racing. He could hear his own voice replaying in his head, the words sounding harsher now, louder. "But you look more like a salad guy." What the hell had he been thinking? How could he have been so stupid? His arrogance had blinded him. He had assumed, like he always did, that he could read people, that he could tell who was important and who wasn't just by looking at them. But now he knew he had completely miscalculated. This man he had mocked, was the most powerful person in the entire restaurant. And Ethan had disrespected him. It wasn't just Ethan who noticed. Others in the restaurant, servers, staff, even some guests were beginning to catch on. The whispers started, the subtle glances, the realization that someone of extreme importance had been dining quietly, unnoticed. The tables near the front suddenly seemed quieter, as though people were suddenly aware of the presence of a man they had overlooked. And Ethan stood frozen, his world collapsing around him. James Carter, still calm as ever, handed his card to Richard with an easy smile. "Dinner was fantastic, as always. Please let the chef know I appreciated it." Richard nodded, still in awe, still eager to please. "Absolutely, Mr. Carter. And if there's ever anything we can do to make your experience even better, just say the word." James nodded, pocketing his card. Then, finally, he turned toward Ethan. For the first time that night, their eyes met again. James said nothing. He didn't have to, because in that one silent moment, Ethan understood everything. James had known the entire time. He had known when Ethan had insulted him. He had known when Ethan had dismissed him. He had known, and yet he had let it all play out. Ethan wanted to speak, to apologize, to somehow fix what had just happened, but it was too late. James Carter turned, walked toward the exit, and with a simple push of the door, he was gone. And just like that, the entire restaurant seemed to exhale. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding, his palms sweaty. He had made the worst mistake of his career. And now he would have to live with it. Ethan Miller had always considered himself sharp, someone who understood status, power, and the silent language of wealth. But that night, after James Carter walked out of the restaurant without a word, something inside Ethan shifted. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, the sinking, gut-wrenching realization of just how badly he had screwed up. For the first time in his life, his arrogance had consequences. Ethan spent the rest of his shift in a daze. The restaurant kept moving, conversations continued, plates were cleared, drinks were served, but he wasn't really there anymore. He could feel the whispers from his coworkers, the way some of them shot him side glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Richard, the restaurant manager, had barely acknowledged him since James left. That, more than anything, was a bad sign. Ethan finished his shift without speaking to anyone. When he walked out into the cool Los Angeles night, he felt like a different person than the one who had walked in just hours ago. Because now he knew the truth. He had insulted one of the most powerful men in the country, and James Carter had let him. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his tiny apartment, replaying the moment over and over again. "You look more like a salad guy." It echoed in his head like a cruel joke, mocking him. He thought about the silence at the table, the glances exchanged between the other guests, the way James had looked at him. At the time, Ethan had dismissed it. Now it felt like the moment everything had changed. He couldn't stop thinking about it. How many other guests had he misjudged? How many people had he subtly disrespected, assuming they weren't worth his time? How often had he let his own ego dictate how he treated people? The realization hit him harder than he expected, because the truth was, he had done this before. Maybe not always with insults, but with dismissiveness, assumptions, arrogance. And now he was paying for it. Ethan tried to shake it off, tried to focus on his job, on his routine, on pretending that nothing had happened. But the weight of it never left him. Every time he stepped into the restaurant, he could feel it. The way the staff still whispered about what had happened. The way Richard barely spoke to him anymore. The way guests at the restaurant seemed different now. Or maybe, he realized, it was him who had changed. For the first time, he saw things differently. He noticed how easy it was for people like him to dismiss others based on nothing but surface-level judgments. He saw the way certain guests were treated with extra care, while others, people who didn't look the part, were given only the bare minimum of politeness. He had been part of that system, and he hated it. He hated the thought that he had spent the last 2 years believing he was better than the people he served, and all it had taken was one moment with James Carter to tear it all down. Then, the news came. One of the servers was talking near the kitchen, casually mentioning that James Carter had made another reservation for next week. Ethan stopped breathing. James Carter was coming back. This was it. His only chance. The thought of it made his stomach churn. Would James even remember him? Of course he would. Would he ignore him? Maybe. Would he even care about an apology? Ethan didn't know, but that didn't matter, because Ethan needed to do this. For once in his life, he needed to own up to his mistake. For the next few days, Ethan prepared himself. He thought about what he would say. At first, he considered making excuses. It was just a joke. I didn't mean it in a bad way. I had no idea who you were. But every single excuse felt pathetic, because the truth was, it didn't matter who James Carter was. He should have treated everyone with respect. He shouldn't have judged someone just by looking at them. So no excuses, just an apology. A real one. Ethan didn't know if James would accept it, didn't know if it would even make a difference. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about looking good or saving face or his reputation. He just knew that he had to make this right. No matter how uncomfortable it was. The day finally came. James Carter was due to arrive at 7:30 p.m. Ethan spent the whole day nervous, anxious, restless. He could barely focus on his tasks. Every time the front door opened, his heart leapt into his throat. Then, at exactly 7:32 p.m., James Carter walked into the restaurant. Ethan spotted him immediately. He looked exactly the same, calm, composed, effortlessly in control. If he remembered Ethan, he didn't show it. Ethan swallowed hard. His pulse hammered in his ears. This was the moment. No running, no hiding, no excuses. With his heart pounding, Ethan took a deep breath and walked straight toward James Carter. Ethan Miller had never felt his heart pound this hard. As James Carter walked through the front doors of La Maison, effortlessly composed as always, Ethan felt his breath hitch. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. The moment he had been preparing for. No more running. No more pretending nothing had happened. It was time to face his mistake. For a brief second, Ethan hesitated. The instinct to avoid confrontation was strong. What if James didn't care? What if he brushed him off? What if he just ignored him? Ethan had never apologized like this before, not out of true remorse. But then James turned slightly, speaking to the restaurant manager. And Ethan knew if he didn't do it now, he never would. So with every nerve in his body screaming at him to stop, Ethan forced his feet to move. One step, then another, until suddenly he was standing right in front of James Carter. James looked at him, his expression unreadable. Ethan swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. This was a man who had been in boardrooms with the most powerful people in the world, and here Ethan was, a waiter who had insulted him, trying to make things right. There was no easy way to do this, so Ethan just spoke. "Mr. Carter," he started, his voice slightly unsteady, "I want to sincerely apologize for how I treated you last time." James didn't react, just watched him. Ethan took a deep breath and continued. "I was wrong to judge you based on appearances. I've thought about it a lot, and I've learned an important lesson." His heart pounded. His palms were sweating. James Carter could tear him apart with a single sentence, but instead, he did something else. He simply studied Ethan, his sharp eyes assessing him like he was trying to decide if this apology was real. The silence stretched. Ethan felt it like a weight on his chest. Then finally James nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice calm. "You were wrong." Ethan's stomach dropped, but then James added something that Ethan didn't expect. "But I respect that you had the courage to stand here and admit it." Ethan blinked. Of all the responses he had prepared for, this wasn't one of them. James wasn't angry, he wasn't dismissive, he wasn't even cold. He was teaching him. And Ethan understood. Because in that moment, Ethan realized something deeply important. The apology wasn't for James. It was for himself. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it wasn't the kind of relief that came from avoiding punishment. It was the kind that came from understanding. An apology alone wasn't enough. He had to change, had to prove, not to James, not to his coworkers, but to himself, that he had learned something. So from that day forward, Ethan did things differently. It wasn't immediate. He didn't suddenly become a perfect person overnight, but he started paying attention. He stopped assuming. He started listening. He treated every guest with respect, real respect, not because they were wealthy, not because they could tip well, not because they wore expensive suits, but because they were human, because everyone deserved to be seen, because he never wanted to make someone feel small again. Weeks passed. Ethan kept his head down, kept working, kept improving, and then, one evening, something happened. James Carter walked through the restaurant doors again. This time, Ethan saw him immediately, noticed the way he carried himself. The same calm confidence, the same effortless presence, but something was different, not about James, about Ethan. This time there was no hesitation, no panic, no fear. Ethan walked straight to him and greeted him with genuine warmth. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. It's great to see you again." James looked at him for a moment, then a small, knowing smile crossed his face. "Good to see you too, Ethan." And then, the part that meant everything. "You look more confident than last time." Ethan felt something inside him shift, because he was. For the first time in his life, he understood. Respect wasn't about money, wasn't about status, wasn't about power. It was about how you treated people. And that was the lesson James Carter had given him. Without ever raising his voice, without ever needing revenge, without ever demanding anything. James had taught him simply by being who he was, and Ethan, he was better for it. Ethan never forgot that night, never forgot the lesson James Carter had taught him, because it wasn't just about one mistake. It was about how we choose to see people, and how, sometimes, the greatest transformations come from the smallest moments, the ones where we have to ask ourselves, who am I really? How do I treat the people around me? And am I willing to change? Ethan had his answer now, and for the first time he was proud of it.